This is the last talk in the economics and game theory section of the academy. I think it's I think it's probably the most interesting section. It is for me at least, because I've spent quite a lot of the last, I don't know, year or two working in specifically this area. It's an interesting intersection between game theory, economics, and elements of sociology, political science. And with the tools that we have now that have been sort of developed in the last 15 years, I think we can we are sort of on the precipice of developing much more interesting systems, which is not to say that everything that we have understood so far becomes invalid. Quite the opposite. It's just that it can be viewed in a new light, and we can create potentially like new agile systems, composing some of the older, more sort of traditional mechanisms. But there may also be some very interesting sort of new discoveries, I suppose, in some sense that we can make in this field. And as implementers, implementers sort of on the edge, in this very sort of new area with these new systems, it's, as it turns out, us who can have the ability to run these new experiments and make the new discoveries, more so than those who would be traditionally working in this area, like political scientists and sociologists. So, it's a pretty cool position to be in. We're going to sort of talk about two sort of main areas. Firstly, the means of making decisions, why we want to make decisions, why we want to have collectives be able to make decisions, what it means, and how we can think about it. This module is going to be a little bit more conceptual, a little bit more critical thinking-y, rather than sort of mathematically rigorous. There will be some rigor in the voting mechanisms that I'll show you, but a lot of it is really about trying to introduce you to new conceptual language so that you're actually able to think in some of these like new terms. So, collective decision making. It's in pretty sort of broad term that basically means how a collective of individuals is able to make a decision that in some sense represents them, all of them. It's representative. And it might cover all sorts of things, governance processes, policy making, budget allocate. These are all elements that fall within this broad topic. We assume that the collective that the individuals who make up a collective are not all the same, I don't know, all copies of each other, all duplicates of each other. People are different. This is like one of the main premises. If all the people are basically the same, then collective decision making becomes an awful lot easier, because anyone can speak for everyone else. So that's why we consider it in a heterogeneous manner. Our assumptions are that different people have different preferences, different priorities, but somehow um, we need to come up with a way of allowing the collective en masse to make a single decision. So we need to be able to aggregate, right? Aggregate preferences, aggregate, or at least aggregating the preferences seems like a reasonable direction to go in order to make decisions for the collective, on behalf of the collective. So it's a way of reaching a decision over what it is that the collective is and what resources the collective has and how the collective appears or acts within its external environment. This is the crucial bit. It's not, or it's less about determining how the collective acts internally and more about how the collective acts within an external environment. In essence, if the collective has some sort of authority, like if it can command some resources, we need to understand how we can create decisions or instructions that utilize that authority. So why do we do it? Well, I mean, as we can see, there are many instances of it having been done. Countries are a really obvious example, right? A country can be considered a collective of its population, and there are occasions when a country needs to make a decision that affects everybody. Right? One of them is, should it go to war? Right? How should it defend itself in the case of aggression? What should its laws be internally? There are many. Companies, another example, right? So we have shareholders of a company, the owners of a company. We have to work out how to decide what that company should do. Now, in theory, the owner, if there's one, has absolute power. But if there are many different owners, then there needs to be some means of collectivizing the ownership and then allowing that collective to speak with a single voice. Institutions, and so on. The list is very large. In general, decision making will need to be agile because there may be things in the external environment that affect the collective. And if it cannot make a decision fast, then it may represent an existential threat to that collective. Yeah. It cannot react. Essentially, it's like a really slow thing. And if there's a really fast thing that's trying to attack it, then this could be a major problem. And if it's not quite such an acute thing, but if it's still nonetheless slower than its potential competitor collectives, than other entities in its environment, then it may become irrelevant, it may become redundant, and it may by losing its relevance, it ultimately fades. Eventually gets dissolved, one imagines. Now, we must also consider the internal elements of a collective, but I will argue that the internal elements of a collective are only really there in order to define how it acts within its environment. Which is essentially to say a collective that includes literally everything in the system, in the universe, isn't really a collective. Yeah? A collective needs to be exclusive for it to be a collective at all. Yep. Collectives span a huge There are such a broad types of collectives that it's that our definition has to be accordingly broad. It really is sort of conceptual in its very nature. We're not trying to be specific over saying, well, a company is a collective, but a loosely knit set of artists is not a collective. Yeah, we're not trying to be particularly specific over the nature of the implementation of the collective. In fact, the only real thing that we can say about what a collective is that it speaks with a single voice to its external environment. Yeah, there is some notion of a single entity that has now become from these multiple parts, these distinct parts. In sort of our world, sort of blockchain, Web3 systems, and so forth, we think, heavily about economics and security. These are sort of two very crucial elements, and necessarily that's going to be the decisions about the collective, the decisions that the collective will make will be, many of them will be within these sort of two spheres. If a decision-making system is weak or slow, then this collective, this entity, this single thing will find it difficult to evolve over time, or difficult to react to its changing environment. And our environment is always changing. So having an effective means of making decisions, and indeed making decisions that are beneficial for the collective and are take full knowledge of its environment, is necessary over time to guarantee the continued existence of that collective. This is a long way of saying the collective decision-making process, an effective one, is absolutely crucial if one is to build a long-lasting entity. So let's think a little bit more profoundly. There's a song by Pink Floyd on the album Dark Side of the Moon called Breathe. And the last two lines of this verse, I think, are quite represent a quite interesting interpretation. All you touch and all you see is all your life will ever be. Right? Now, when we think of what someone's life is, we might come up with all sorts of ideas about how to consider what it is. Right? But in a very poetic way, this is essentially saying that one's interactions with the external world, right, the effects that one has caused, in essence, can be used to define that life, that individual. Yeah? And if we take this a little bit more formally, we might say that any single entity within a system may be identified as the aggregate of its interactions with its external environment, with the rest of the system. Yeah? That's how we can define a subset of the overall system, this collective, which we, as I've said before, we define as a subset. It can never be the entire system. So it's a subset. It's an identifiable subset of individuals. It may change over time, but nonetheless, it's identifiable over time. And we can identify it as the aggregate of its interactions with its environment. Now, if a system's governance wholly defines these interactions through a set of rules or whatever, but if it wholly defines these interactions, then we can thereby identify it as the entity. Now, this seems a little strange because we would think, well, there's a lot to something, but it's not just its governance. But under this argument, the governance, because it has the ability to change the entity, the collective, in whatever way it sees fit, following the overall rules of the system, of course, then the governance, by definition, defines the interactions that the entity will make in any given environment. And therefore, it defines the entity. If there is no governance, if it's in a situation where the entity, the collective, if you like, can never change, like its internal rule structure is fixed from creation and will stay fixed, there is no way that it could ever change until eventual death or breakup, whatever, dissolution, then it's reasonable to sort of compare it to something like a rock. Yeah, it's just inert to its environment. And as a collective is able to react more because it has a decision-making mechanism, because it's actually able to change itself over time and adapt, then we can consider it much closer to some form of life. Yeah, something that actually perpetuates itself and adapts to its environment. Okay. Let's look at common systems then for decision-making, collective decision-making. A dictator, there's an obvious one. So you pick one of the individual entities, and this entity just makes the decisions. Okay, easy. Could be an elected dictator, though of course, unless there's a system for electing another dictator that the dictator cannot change, then that's not very useful. Then the system effectively distills to the dictator. Yeah. Dictator dies, then presumably the system gets dissolved, like the collective gets dissolved. Of course, then you can have things like dynasties, and you can have maybe a re-election or whatever, but then we get slightly more complex systems. Unelected committees, so there's a few of these if you look into the ages, often in very successful market cities. Zurich and London are two examples. Basically, you have, I think Hong Kong actually is another example, where you have subsets of the economy or socio-political system, and you allow these to take part of decision making. So you can sort of be elected, or maybe there's some specific means by which an individual can be approved over because of their contributions or career into one of these groups. And as part of the group, you have the ability to influence the decisions of that group, and then many groups come together to influence the decision of the overall collective, like the city. And these have proven to sort of, in certain environments, be quite long-lasting, relatively stable, not especially inclusive, as inclusive as they needed to be back in the 17 and 1800s. Then we got representative democracy. Democracy is a funny word. I'm going to come back to it. But there are different democratic systems. One of them is, this notion of representation, where basically we have an extra level between the decision making. You can vote for some representative, and they can make the decisions on your behalf. Political parties, sort of similar sort of idea, and then finally direct democracy, where everyone is taking part. These are some examples, right? They're certainly not all of them, but and under what we might want to evaluate these systems. What sort of things are we looking to judge them by? utility, and we're back to this kind of slightly woolly and term within economics of welfare, overall welfare. But for to be useful, decisions to maximize society's welfare. Another utility here, and I think even a more substantial one, but possibly could be considered something relatively similar to this, is it must maximize the chance of existence of the collective, right? The collective must defend itself from dissolution, from assimilation, whatever else. Yeah. And I find it's quite interesting to think when we talk about collectives to try to make analogies into biology, into the world of biology, right? Think single cellular organism, cell wall. Well, a collective kind of has a cell wall. It defines who is inside the collective and who is not inside, who's outside the collective. Yeah. And maybe there are means of getting from the outside in the same way with the cell, osmosis or whatever. And maybe there are ways of getting taking an individual from the inside out. But these are mechanisms, and there are sort of rules or whatever to be followed that govern this process. A cell for a particular design, or I sort of hesitate to use the word design, but for a particular sort of cell, one that is able to sustain itself within the environment is good. Like existence is the primary aim for the organism, and then of course replication, enlargement, growth, whatever might be a secondary aim. So we need to also think of utility in these terms. It's not necessarily the job of the cell is not necessarily to keep all of its constituents, like all the constituent biochemical structures, in perfect shape. It may be able to withstand a portion of its biochemical internals sort of going wrong or whatever, in search for continued existence. Yeah. Utility, a second point, it reflects people's preferences. I mean, this I would say is not a primary utility. It can certainly affect legitimacy, but reflecting the individual's preferences does not necessarily make it useful. Yeah, we must look upon it as a welfare. We must measure it by welfare, possibly of the constituents, but more reasonably of the collective. Yeah. Legitimacy. So legitimacy, I think, again, is actually, it's a secondary goal. It's secondary to existence. Would we rather have a legitimate decision-making mechanism within a company that makes the company go bust, so that afterwards there is no company anymore? Or would we either have a less legitimate decision-making mechanism that nonetheless keeps the company in existence? Well, it seems to me, if in the first case there is no company, then there is no decision-making mechanism and there is no collective. And therefore, we've already failed at the first job. Same with a country, right? And certainly the same with a blockchain. But nonetheless, legitimacy, or rather the lack of it, can result in a breakdown of the mechanism which is helping guarantee continued existence. So it's not that we should ignore legitimacy, but we should view it within the context of aiming to maximize welfare to the collective, of the collective. People trusting the process and the apparency of a fair decision are both good factors, reasonable factors, in the determination of whether a system is legitimate. Okay, practicality. Of course, speed can be very important. As I mentioned before, a collective may be in an adversarial, is almost certainly in an adversarial environment. That's kind of the whole point of economics game theory. And if its adversaries, or its just environment, is changing beyond the ability for the collective to adapt, then the collective risks its existence. Primary goal, existence, continued existence. So, again, secondary to the primary goal of keep the collective going. Whether it's simple to understand could be considered an element of practicality. If it's not simple to understand, then maybe if the rules are too complex, maybe it costs consistency or coherency of the collective. But it could also be considered an element of legitimacy, which is to say, if its constituent individuals are unable to understand the rules that govern its decision-making process, then they may consider it illegitimate. It may reduce the collective's legitimacy, and therefore cause, again, issues with its consistency and coherency, which results in existential breakdown. Good. Legitimacy is essentially what makes its constituent parts continue to accept being in the collective when it appears that the decision-making process has ignored them, has ignored their needs, or whatever. This is like, if it is viewed as legitimate, this allows individuals to rationalize their continued part within a collective. And if the collective seems to be disregarding them and their needs, and they see little legitimacy in the decision-making process, then this effectively leads to the individual becoming disenchanted with their membership. And if this happens en masse, then it can lead to a breakdown in the collective, or coherency being sacrificed. Okay, so think about it in specifics. Dictator, very practical, right? It's very few rules to understand. There is a person, what they say goes. Is it legitimate? Unless everyone has a very strong identity relationship with the dictator, then it is probably not considered legitimate. Of course, there are times where individuals, through whatever processes, can generate an identity relationship en masse with many people within a collective. I think we see some of this already in recent years. It's not that Donald Trump is an especially good decision maker, but nonetheless, a substantial portion of the country in which he resides do seem to consider him legitimate insofar as there is a substantial identity relationship. He's one of us. Direct democracy can generally be considered legitimate as long as the process by which it's executed is considered, can be tested, is considered proper. Yeah. If people feel votes are not being counted, then this is a reason why some may consider it illegitimate. Of course, there are reasons for not using direct democracy. Speed, practicality being a big one, but we'll look a little bit further into that in a little while. So which mechanism maximizes utility? Well, it may very well be that no voting mechanisms actually maximize utility. If you look at futarchy systems, we could use all sorts of non-democratic, non-dictatorial mechanisms to make decisions for the collective, right? We might use market mechanisms. We might use, for example, prediction markets, yeah, where you essentially predict which option will give the better outcome for the collective. You allow the market to sort of figure it out, and then you go with whatever the market decides. This would be one possibility of a governance mechanism which doesn't involve giving power to specific individuals. It may massively reduce the legitimacy because it becomes so opaque. Yeah, this is the problem. But it could maximize utility. And if we have something like an acute threat to the collective's existence, where fast-moving, fast decisions need to be made, even at the cost of individuals feeling that the system may be illegitimate, even at the risk of sacrificing an element of utility, like maybe the decisions are wrong, and not just illegitimately arrived at, but they're also just incorrect. But if we cannot risk slow decisions, then we may have to move to a period of dictatorship. So, dictator, legitimate, probably not. Very practical though. Yeah, decisions can be made very quickly. Good in case of an emergency, like as I say, if there's like an acute threat to the existence. But stability, it could be stable for a while if the individual is a stable individual. But people, especially people with in an environment where they have a high degree of absolute power, are rarely stable. Yeah. Even if they start stable, they may not be stable for very long. So democracy. This is from a TV show, Peep Show. Comes very highly recommended. I suspect not many of you have seen it. Might be one or two. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, okay, like maybe 10. Very good. Democracy. Why can't I have everything I want all of the time? That's what democracy is, isn't it? There's a lot of democracy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In some sense, it's considered like, maybe not now, but 20 years ago, it was considered like the pinnacle of government, right? It's like, yes, we've arrived. We have democracy. Now, democracy doesn't really exist in any practical system, certainly not for countries. But so we can describe systems as being more or less democratic, right? So we can have highly democratic systems, and then we can have quite democratic systems, and then we have systems that are not very, they involve some voting, but they're not very democratic at all, really. Describing things as democracies is reductive. It doesn't give you very much back. Yeah? Is America a democracy? Well, practically speaking, you have two choices, and they both do more or less the same thing. So is it a democracy? No, it's better described as a two-party state, yeah, which is only marginally better than a one-party state, which we already basically describe as an autarky or a dictatorship. So let's look at direct democracy. Every person is consulted for every decision. This is the most democratic model for democracy, we might say. Highly legitimate. Hey, I've been listened to. I put my vote in as long as I'm reasonably sure it was aggregated equally and fairly with everyone else's votes. I have no reason to. I have no comeback. There is no rational argument. Well, there are, but there is no. It's reasonable to argue that I have been listened to. I've had my fair share of power. And it's good at, yeah, if there are overall preferences of the collective, it's good at revealing it. Now, this does not necessarily mean that they are what the collective should do. If we remember, the point of a collective is not to represent its individual constituents' opinions in aggregate. It is to maximize welfare of the collective, yeah? And if its individual constituents are idiots and they want to disband the collective or do something which would disband the collective inadvertently, then it's not reasonable to say that that's what should happen. Like if they do it because they actually want to do it, if they're like, no, this collective is bad, we don't think it should exist. Okay, that's a slightly different thing. But if they're doing it because they think it's good for the collective, they're just stupid. Then we have to realize that our two goals are at odds with each other, right? We cannot necessarily have both apparent legitimacy and maximize the chance that the collective will remain in existence, maximize welfare of the collective. And we have to choose what our priorities are. And a collective whose priority is not primarily maximizing the chance of its own existence, I would argue, is unlikely to stay in existence for very long. Okay, but nonetheless, you know, it's got some very important elements to it. One of which, possibly the most, is that it can quickly take in lots of ideas of what decisions should be made. Yeah. So it has a really good broad possibility of like considering stuff. It's not necessarily very good at actually making a decision, but all of the options, good at like getting lots of options in to consider. Yeah. Another example of, you know, and this is I bring back to like take the US as an example, two-party system. You may not fit especially well into one party or the other, and you're forced essentially to consider what issue it is that matters most to you. And there may be a lot of different issues in a lot of different areas of society and law. But you don't, you're not able to actually express yourself, your preferences, or indeed contribute to the overall welfare of the collective in your own way. It's really just a Boolean decision. I vote either left or right, red or blue. And this therefore results in a very let's say, compromised means of gathering information from the constituent parts and determining the actions that should be done based on it. This is how we should see it in a sort of in a game theoretic way, where we really want to, where we're aiming for the result to be maximizing the collective's utility. We actually compromise that by forcing individuals to choose, between options that are not really indicative of their actual preferences. And again, if you've got two parties and they both have the same policy on a particular subject, you're screwed. Like, you are completely unrepresented. Yeah, you have no way of getting your voice heard. So in reality, if your priority is, I don't know, common nuclear disarmament, but neither of the two main parties consider this, like have a policy that would represent this, you're basically forced to either not vote for a party you know is going to lose, or or vote for one of the two parties anyway on based on another priority that you have that is lower. Yeah, and we are kind of in a go back to yesterday. With a two-party system, you very quickly end up in a Nash equilibrium or something approximating it for voting. In that, it doesn't make, even if a majority or a sizable minority of the population would vote for a third party whose policy was something quite different that neither of the main two supported, no individual voter should do that, because by doing so, they would lose their influence over the main two parties. Yeah, lose their influence over which of the two main parties would win. And unless they have a knowledge that literally another 30% of the voting population would also vote for the third option, then there is no reason for them to vote for the third option. And so it just doesn't change, right? It's just inertia. Good. All right. So it's also not very practical, although it's like last 15, 20 years with the internet and cryptography and all this, like it's becoming very practical. But it's certainly by the people who would have to implement it, which is to say governments, who still largely work in pen and paper, it's not very practical, right? But maybe we can change that. Typical direct democracy systems work only with one decision at a time. Kind of dumb, but there you go, because typical direct democracy systems work still in pen and paper, right? And it takes a while to organize a referendum for an entire country. So it's not realistic to have this stuff for anything that needs to be done on less than a 2-month timeline, unless we use new technology. Yeah. All right. Does a direct democracy maximize utility? Well, no, basically, right? It's good at maximizing legitimacy. It's not going to maximize utility. And what we see is that for almost any vote, it's not worth most people voting. It's economically, financially not worth it. So then we see, well, maybe we can incentivize voting. In Australia, if you don't vote, you get fined and eventually put in prison. Right? It's like you have to vote. It's your duty to vote. But yes, in general, voting, the voting costs will exceed the payback, the expected benefit from it, which is obviously drives down turnout. We can look at voting in a direct democracy as a common good game. It's not, as an individual, it's not optimal to vote, to actually bother voting, but yet, for the overall collective, we might reasonably argue it is optimal if everyone does vote. We might reasonably argue. We certainly, we could very reasonably argue that everyone voting would provide us with useful information on which to make a decision. We might not necessarily want to just automatically go with that, but it's certainly reasonable to utilize that information in any ultimate decision. Okay. Low turnout reduces legitimacy and, reduces information content that the collective has, or the decision-making apparatus of the collective has, in order to actually arrive at a decision. In Switzerland, where we actually have direct democracy, we see turnouts of around 30%. Now, this doesn't rotate very quickly. These referenda take a while to set up and be executed, but nonetheless, 30%. And we might see voting turnouts upwards of this in a in a sort of 4 or 5 yearly cycle, not in a direct democracy, but in a parliamentary or constituency-based democracy. It's still low, right? It's still not great. But better technology and progressive voting systems, so voting systems, for example, that don't have just a single day in which you can register your vote. Yeah. Voting systems that allow you to understand the turnout and the way it's going in order to make a rational decision on when and when you should vote, whether you should vote. For example, if it's a no-brainer, if it's like a very uncontroversial vote, then it's reasonable for there to be a low turnout. It's reasonable not to require everybody to go to the polls and waste on aggregate a huge amount of resources, time of the collective. It's reasonable to let just a subset go. If the minority who would disagree, have the chance to go and register their disagreement. Yeah. For example, suppose there's a proposal. 99% agree with the proposal, 1% disagree. It's perfectly reasonable to only require 1.1% of those that are in favor of the proposal to actually have to bother getting up and voting. Yeah? Because the other 97.9% will be happy with the decision anyway. They can check to see how the voting's going. They see it's going in a way that they're happy. They stay at home, right? They don't bother clicking yes, I approve. Legitimacy is preserved because even though their vote wasn't counted, it went in the direction that they're happy with. Yeah. And for the 1% that disagreed, legitimacy is again preserved because they were heard. It turned out that there were more people that wanted it to go the other way, but that's the rules of the system. So we can start thinking of systems that preserve legitimacy and increase practicality, but we can only do so with tools that allow information feedback for voters. Yeah, allow voters to vote over a longer period of time, that allow for agile determination of when a vote should end and when it should continue. It's reasonable that an uncontroversial vote can end sooner than a controversial vote. A controversial vote might indicate that more people need time to actually come to a proper decision and get up and actually click a button. If it's a controversial vote, it should probably not be done ended in like a day. It should be, it maybe takes a week or 4, longer. Whereas an uncontroversial vote, if like nobody disagrees, it's perfectly reasonable once it's clear, once we can be reasonably sure nobody's disagreeing, to end the vote early. And then there's obviously a question of, well, how much time do we need for that to happen? But we can create systems that can optimize this trade-off. And indeed, OpenGov is one of them that really does try to do this. Okay, rational ignorance. All right, I'm forced to vote, but maybe I'm not going to examine what it is that I'm voting on. Yeah, I'll just take the first answer, whatever the default is. It's not worth my time reading about the context of the vote. This is also an issue, right? And from this, we can start thinking of, well, maybe you have to prove that you know something in order for your vote to be counted. Or maybe the more that you know about a subject, more that you know, the more that you can show that you're a critical thinker, more that you can show that you've actually are familiar with the issues of the vote, then the more your vote is weighted, right? And this obviously moves away from legitimacy, potentially, but may ultimately maximize the chance that the collective survives. Yeah. Maybe not, but there's an argument to be made. It may be that we can, if we're not careful, our environment can bias what part of the voting population turns out. This is also something to be aware of in our modern era, where media is everywhere and it's not all very honest or free from prejudice and bias. Again, we can come up with, there are ideas of how to work around this, but we have to be careful. So some of the more traditional ideas, well, one of them is representative democracy. I would not argue that this is an especially great solution, but here we are. We have it in many countries. Essentially, where we're electing a committee, right, whose job it is to look at the issues and make a reasonable determination of which way to vote on the basis of those issues. Now, I'm not especially, I'm not in any way really active in politics, but there was a time back in 2002, 2003, where the EU was considering software patents. So traditionally, historically, the EU has not been provided any kind of law for the protection of software inventions, right? It's pretty specific that inventions have to be physical, which as an open source coder is the way that I like it. And unfortunately, a lot of bigger multinationals, especially multinationals coming from the States, get a bit upset at this because they really like the ability to patent huge swathes of stuff that is pretty obvious to any good coder. It allows them to build up a large potential defense, so they can't. They end up basically with the kingpins of their industry, and they can erect huge barriers to entry. Yeah. Even if you're a new entrant, you've discovered something actually legitimately cool and valuable, you're probably unable to use it because what you've discovered probably requires the usage of countless minor patents that were issued by a understaffed and underfunded patent office that you would have to defend in court should one of the big cheeses, IBM, Microsoft, whoever, fear that you might take their market, steal their market away from them. And of course, court cases, especially corporate court cases, are incredibly expensive. They're more expensive than most startups would be able to bankroll. And so what tends to happen is the startup sells the patent for not very much money, and these big cheeses just continue their existence in their oligopoly, and as an overall consequence, welfare of society is compromised. So there you go. That's my argument against software patents. Now, in the EU, there's the EU Parliament. These are the guys that would have made this law, would have put the law forward. And I wrote to my 5 EU parliamentary representatives explaining I'm a PhD student. I write open source software. I know about this stuff. This is a dumb idea. Don't do it. And of course, all 5 of them wrote back with a standard template letter saying, you don't know what you're, in a very nice way, I should point out, you don't know what you're on about. I've looked into this. I know the issues. Leave it alone. Representative democracy for the win. In principle, the idea is that the politicians who we elect actually do look into the issues. In reality, there are all sorts of environmental factors why they basically ignore the issues, or they look to a very biased interpretation of the issues, and they're certainly not there to think critically most of the time. Now we have delegated voting. This is like a more agile version of representative democracy. There are still representatives, but the idea is that we can use our voting power to sort of place representatives in, and we can have many sort of representatives. They essentially just command our vote. And it might be multi-layer, so we might vote for our representative, and then our representative votes for their representative, until eventually you end up with, a bunch of kind of root level representatives, each commanding a reasonable swathe of voting power. Liquid democracy is basically that. It's as far as I know, hasn't really been tried in any nation state kind of system, but it has the potential, I think, to improve on representative, like these static delegation systems. And it is in use on Polkadot and Kusama, although not that many people are using it. Interestingly, representative democracy is in use on Polkadot, was in use on Kusama by virtue of the council. This is being removed, in part because of the arguments I just made. Advanced forms of democracy, right? So if we're going to try and improve on these democratic systems, some more than others, what can we do? Well, liquid democracy, agile delegation, one of them. Multi-track delegation, for those of you who were there at Raoul's event yesterday, this is one of the things I was mentioning. Multi-track delegation is essentially the ability to delegate separately for different kinds of votes. We might say any vote that's on gender equality, this is the person I want to represent me. Any vote that's on defense spending, this is the person I want to represent me. Any vote that's on patents, this is the person I want to represent me, and so forth. With each, where we define a number of different tracks, which basically are these different kinds of votes, right? And by doing so, we can have a much more nuanced representation without actually having to take part in every vote. Yeah. We might also, one of the quadratic voting annoyingly means two different things. So we have to be very careful about which quadratic voting we're talking about. The two different things are basically, one of them is my voting power should be the square root of some other thing, like the resources that I bring to the table, right? This is the not so good version of quadratic voting. The other version of quadratic voting is that I might reasonably ignore some votes or choose not to have a voice in some matters in order to have a significantly greater voice in other matters, which essentially means if I spread my votes out perfectly, I might have like one vote in each decision. But if I say, well, I don't care about this one, and I don't care about this one, and I don't care about this one, but I really care about this one, then I'm essentially able to aggregate my overall voting power and get 2 votes instead of 1 in this 4th decision. Essentially, like, I add up my 1 vote here, my 1 vote there, my 1 vote there, my 1 vote there. I get 4, and then I take the square root of 4, and I end up with 2. So I can basically double my voting power if I'm willing to give up on 3 other votes, 3 other ballots. This only works in systems where we are strongly Sybil resistant. Sybil resistance is essentially the ability to identify a unique individual. Yeah, and in blockchain systems, we do not generally have this solution. In blockchain systems, we can identify a currency, like a token. We can say there's this amount of tokens that want to do such and such, or that have such and such an instruction. But what we can't do is say it represents a person. Like the concept of a person is completely foreign to a blockchain. It just has no clue, right? Blockchains are fundamentally economic systems, not human-oriented systems, anthropological systems. We might also have optimistic approval. So this is basically what I was talking about before, where we might say, well, if it's uncontroversial, then we pass the vote quickly. But if it's controversial, then we extend the voting period. We might continually extend it up until some asymptote, up until some particular time that is like the maximum possible voting period. But we might continually extend it as long as, for example, enough more votes are coming in or enough controversy remains. Yeah. There are others, but I mean, maybe that's something that can be discussed later. So if we have delegated voting, we get a committee. Committees will tend to ignore certain information, and I will say information rather than preferences. Preferences are information, but we must remember, in the context of maximizing the chance of the collective surviving, preferences are information with which we can make a decision, but they are not necessarily the single sole determining factor of that decision. Okay, so a committee may ignore information coming from small cliques, right? Their preferences. Indeed, it may, in certain cases, systematically ignore those preferences. For example, in the UK, there is a third party that are not completely inconsequential, like in the US. And this third party, the UK's voting system is basically even more retrograde. Maybe you could argue one way or the other. But anyway, it's a very archaic voting system, first past the post, which basically means that the country is split up into 300 wards or constituencies, and each one elects a politician to go and make the big decisions, the committee. Now, only one can be elected, and the one with the most votes gets elected. It's that simple. If you have two, for example, suppose you have, well, we'll go into the means of electing later, actually, vote counting later. The point is that we can get into a situation where a particular party, and therefore a preference of a clique, the clique represents maybe 20% or 25% of society, but the number of elected representatives that they get, the proportion of the committee representing that clique is near zero, right? It's maybe 2 or 3%. That's the situation that we can get into. And this is, this is problematic. And it's something that could almost certainly be fixed with much more agile, sort of liquid democracy style delegation. But as long as we're doing these sort of very static, historical, archaic voting systems, then we don't really get close. So system capture, I would say, is there are plenty of examples of system capture, but basically it's where there is a portion of the voting population that completely control the system. They control decision making. Decision making ceases to be representative. It ceases to be widely considered as legitimate, and we have an issue with we basically become incoherent, right? Coherency of the collective goes away, and when coherency of the collective goes away, we end up with, at its very extreme, civil war, right? At the moment, I think we're just, it's like very. We have the culture wars, but culture wars can be exploited. I think we're already kind of seeing that in the world. And in theory, in principle, if this continues for too long, then we may end up with increasingly bad things happening within the system. So coherency is important, and for this reason, legitimacy is important. Apparent legitimacy is important. Okay. A dictatorship necessarily represents a system capture because the dictator is the one making the decisions, right? They are the most pure form of system capture. But even within a democracy, even within a representative democracy, if we have a highly aligned 51%, then this can represent a tyranny of majority. Yep. If we do not have a highly aligned 51%, if everyone is kind of very non-aligned, they're all kind of vote in their own way on different things, then obviously the tyranny of the majority is less of an issue. All right, so let's think. Here's an example of democratic system capture. Movie club. You've got a bunch of people who get together, want to watch a movie, right? 40% are into comedy, 30% like drama, and the other 30% like action. Now, if we do a simple vote, we'll find that comedy wins every time. Yeah. This is the problem. So what do? They just watch comedy every time. Well, what about the majority who don't want to watch comedy, or rather like something other than comedy? How do we manage that? There are better ways of aggregating preference, right? And coming up with something that maximizes utility of the collective. I mean, this collective probably wouldn't last very long, because democracy does not maximize the utility of the collective. Yeah. I mean, maybe they go like once or twice, they meet, and then eventually these guys just get like, well, I've sat through comedy twice now. When are we going to watch an action film? Yeah. They stop turning up. This is a problem. Eventually the collective boils down to this 40%. And it ceases to be a movie club. It becomes a comedy club. Maybe that's the way it should go, but it shrinks, right? It becomes less relevant. It has fewer resources, less representation within the overall environment. Right. As I say, a dictatorship is captured by definition, and we can end up with the tyranny of the majority. One interesting possibility that is kind of democratic, but often disregarded, is random dictator. This was something that, this came up quite. When I was a teenager, I liked thinking about this kind of thing, and one of my good friends, who's, as it happens, the vice president of the Web3 Foundation and one of the original founders of Parity, introduced me to this concept. It's like one of the purest forms of democracy is you just select someone at random every day, right? They get to dictate what it is for the day, but after that, at midnight, you find someone else at random. As long as, of course, you can guarantee that power transition will happen. You can guarantee that it is actually a random selection, and that the previous dictator cannot, do something to prevent that from happening. So they're kind of not a perfect dictator, right? They're not. It's the dictatorial element is not perfect. They can't dictate a new constitution, but within this relatively simple constitution, they can make whatever decisions that they want. Then this is very representative. Everyone has the same chance, right? It's fair. And this, as it turns out, for a movie club, would work pretty well, right? It's just like every week, someone gets to choose the movie, 60% of the time, or whatever, 40% of the time, on average, over a sufficiently long period, it will be a comedy, 30%, whatever, an action, 30%, it'll be a drama. Pretty cool. Problem is, if you need any kind of stability, yeah, because you get one dictator one day that says, right, well, we'll have no taxes. And it's like, oh, great, okay. So the tax office closes down, all the tax guys become unemployed. Well, the next day, someone says, no, actually, we need lots of taxes. Have to re-employ them. It's a big thing. But and so we say, right, well, let's still do a random dictator, but maybe they just dictate for a month or a year. Well, now you're into system capture territory. It's like if you've got a year of some nut job that wants to, just get rid of all of the government, then you're gonna risk existential threat to the collective. It works in certain situations where the stakes are pretty low and we can manage instability well. It doesn't work uh, in most other situations. One of the situations where it does work, where it's actually being utilized in blockchain, is in block authorship. Yeah. So, for example, suppose you have a set of validators, so a set of people who maintain the network, have been voted in or whatever, a committee, if you like, and you select one of them randomly every time unit, every 6 seconds, for example, to create a new set of transactions that should be, made canonical. Well, this is precisely what Polkadot does. Yeah, we actually do a random dictator. Now, the dictatorial, as I say, the dictatorial powers are not like extensive. They are limited to selecting the transactions and ordering them as they wish. But still, they are nonetheless powers that need to be handed out, and those powers change at random every 6 seconds. The trick is to ensure that those powers, that it is only those powers you give the dictator, right? For example, the block author of Polkadot, when they are randomly selected, is not allowed to change what Polkadot is, right? Is not allowed to change the consensus mechanism, is not allowed to change the constraints under which they are allowed to dictate. So it's why is it used? Well, it's really efficient, right? Randomly selecting a number is pretty quick. When you use the right crypto, it's pretty secure. Highly capture resistant. It's really hard to form a clique that will always control the system. And in the context of blockchain, of course, capture resistancy is basically, well, one of the big points of being resistant to capture is censorship, right? If it's always the same set of individuals, then they can, who are creating the blocks, and the minority never get a look in, then they can ensure that a particular transaction never actually gets placed in the blockchain. In general, very bad for stability, which is why we have to control what powers the dictator has. So a dictatorship is fully captured. It's very questionable whether it's stable. It's maybe stable in the short term. It's unlikely to be stable in the long term. A democracy does have a clear risk of capture, particularly a democracy where there's elections, like a committee-based democracy. It has a substantial risk of capture, but it tends to be very stable. A random dictatorship, very resistant to capture, very, very unstable. So we do see sort of trade-offs in these different systems. Okay, that's what I want to talk about that's what I want to talk about for collective decision-making for now. The main point I want to emphasize here is, actually, there's two. I'll re-emphasize, utility is the crucial thing here. We're looking to keep the system going. That's our primary purpose. If we cannot keep the system in existence, the collective in existence, if we cannot keep it coherent, then we are not the collective, the rules for the collective, the decision-making mechanism for the collective is not doing its job, and it will cease to exist, at least in its in the form that it began and presumably wants to continue. Legitimacy is not a guarantor of existence or utility, but it is a tool to help retain existence. And with new technology, we have new tools in order to try out perhaps some ideas that have been proposed but wouldn't work due to their complexities, or potentially that could be combined, composed with other tools, or potentially new mechanisms that that could not have existed without this level of agility and inclusion in terms of information information interaction between the constituents. Phones, right? Like the fact that there's internet everywhere. This is the fact that we have crypto that allows us to authorize something with a strong, very strong guarantee that I did actually do it. The fact that we have zero knowledge proofs to show that the system actually did come up with this, decision, despite, or the information, the preferences of the individuals were such, without having to give up privacy and therefore potentially compromise what my self-representation. These are all like crucial elements that could help create this next generation of democracy. We'll do some questions, but first there were a couple of things that a couple of questions that I got asked during the break, which I think are worth spending a little bit of time on. First one was concerning what sort of use are these systems if all they really do is inform, a bigger authority, with the specific sort of thing being, well, who places the random dictator in their position, in their job, like who gets to operate the machine that sort of randomly selects them, and how do we know that this machine isn't compromised? And of course, this is generalizable to any human system that where the operation of that enforces the rules of the system may itself be defined by the current ruler, yeah, and therefore is at risk of corruption. And I think you don't have to look too far in the world to see real life examples of this. Well, this is sort of what this is talking about. If the system is such that the actual power is not held by the rules of the system, but rather by the arbitrary decisions that we hope are in line with the rules of the system of some dictator, then we have a problem. Now, the UK is officially, technically termed a constitutional monarchy, which sort of implies there is a dictator, like the Queen or the King at the moment. Now there's a king. But they follow the rules of the system, right? They don't exert authority beyond what authority they're allowed to exert according to some understanding. This isn't an especially good way of guaranteeing that the rules will actually be followed indefinitely. And if all we use this technology for is to count votes better or more efficiently for a dictator to then say 95% voted for me, then that's not the systems that I am addressing. That's something quite different. The point of what I've been talking about is that the systems themselves dictate who will hold power, or if indeed there is one individual to hold power. So the rules of Polkadot, the game theoretic underpinnings of Polkadot, the economic underpinnings of Polkadot, are the things that guarantee that block author that is randomly selected cannot arbitrarily alter the rules of Polkadot so they always get selected. Yeah. It's not that there's some sort of faith that the block author will kind of follow the rules well. It's that there is a game theoretic mechanism surrounding the production of blocks that help guarantee to all, beyond reasonable doubt that this will continue indefinitely. Yeah, that's the point of these games. That's the point of having game theory. That's the point of having crypto economics. It's so that we can reason that the rules will be followed regardless of the current sort of set of individuals or whatever that happen to be helping maintain the system. Yeah, just want to get that across. Right. Second point was, I mentioned some of this, some of the open gov stuff in the advanced forms of democracy. Wanted to go, the question was sort of to go a little bit further into that. I do mean to talk more about this in a presentation in the not too distant future, and hopefully while this academy is actually going on. But I'll give a quick sort of sneak preview for those that don't sort of already know. Here is this is a website, Subsquare. It's one of the Polkadot Kusama sort of front ends, if you like, one of the sort of views into what's going on the chain. And I mentioned one of the things I mentioned was like, we might want, if a vote is controversial, we want to keep the voting going for longer, so people have more time to consider. Turnout can be higher. People have more time not just to consider, but to actually, get up, unlock their keys, like find the device, whatever it is, turn their phone on, and actually get a vote in. Yeah. If it looks like the vote is uncontroversial, then it's reasonable to end the voting sooner. If it looks like it's controversial, it should end later. And similarly, depending on how important the vote is, we might reasonably have different thresholds for how controversial it is, or it needs to be, to keep the vote going longer or not. Now we can generalize this into two curves. Indeed, OpenGov does generalize this into two curves. This is how OpenGov works. One of them is support, and the other one is approval. Support is essentially the turnout of those voters who are in favor of it. And approval is essentially the overall voting weight of those that are in favor of it to those who are not in favor of it. If everyone has one vote, then this basically just becomes the total, the amount of yes votes compared to the amount of total voters, whether or not they've voted yes, voted no, voted abstain, or haven't voted at all. And approval becomes the total yes votes. Support becomes the total yes votes and abstain votes out of the total possible voter population. Yeah? Whereas approval is simply the total yes votes compared to the total no votes. Yeah? So approval is just a straight, how many people are for it, how many people are against it. We don't care about abstains, we don't care about people who didn't turn out at all. Whereas support is how many people who did not vote no, how many people voted at all compared to how many people could have voted in total. And what we do is we basically say, here's an example set of curves. This is for tipping, I think. So this is for something that really, it's not so important. If a vote goes through that was a bad decision, it's like the worst that's going to happen is maybe the treasury loses $50. Like it's not a big issue. Yeah, it's not like the treasury it's not like the chain gets bricked. So what we see is that after a relatively short period of time, I don't know, whatever it is, a few hours. The amount of support needed, so basically the turnout, but it's the turnout ignoring the no votes. Why do we ignore the no votes? Well, we would have an issue with strategic voting then, right? We would have an issue that people don't vote no in order to extend the period of voting. Yet we do want people to vote no if they mean to vote no. So in order to fix that issue, we just don't count the no votes for the purposes of determining whether the vote should end early, because it's, because enough people have turned up and actually voted. Obviously, if literally everybody turns up, then it's perfectly reasonable to end the vote as soon as they do. Like all possible representations have been made. We have full information on preferences, yeah? But that's unlikely. It's very rare for turnout to be 100%. I mean, really, really rare. So, but we don't necessarily want to wait 2 weeks to determine whether a tip should be given or not, right? We have better things to be doing. And quite honestly, if someone is after a tip, they don't want to wait 2 weeks to know if they've got $10 in their account or not. So we make a decision relatively quickly, but not immediately. Right? There is a period depending on how many people have voted. Similarly, how much approval is needed before we end early, right? In this case, as long as you have 50% yes votes, as long as your yes votes are greater than the number of no votes, even if it's only by a wafer thin majority, at 56 hours, you'll, or whatever that is, 60 hours, I don't know, like two and a nearly 3 days, it's able to end. Both of these curves must be satisfied. So you must have both, more yes votes than no votes, obviously. This will never drop below 50%, right? If it dropped below 50%, then it would pass even if there were more no votes than yes votes, which we definitely don't want. So this is always bounded here. This one is bounded at, that can start all the way from 100 and go all the way down to 0. Going down to 0 basically means we don't mind if very, very few people turn out, as long as the opportunity in which voting could take place is long enough. And for the point of tips, we can get really quite low quite soon, because, if it's worst case, is not that bad. Now, if we look at the curves for root, here's the curve for root. This is a bit different, you'll see. So for root, now root is basically brick the chain, potentially brick the chain. It's like do anything, super user power, change the rules, right? Amend the constitution, yeah? So for root, it's really important that this is, that no decisions are taken in a hurry, because it's essentially an omnipotent, the privileges attained by root are essentially omnipotent within the system. Right? And so approval starts very, like 100% of people must be in favor of it at the beginning, yeah? Not counting abstentions, but like there can be no dissent whatsoever. And as time goes on, there can be an increasing amount of dissent, but it will still be okay, it will still pass, until eventually, it still has to be like a fairly substantial supermajority here, like, I don't know, 65%, like 2/3, until eventually it does peter out down to 50%. So by the end of a 4-week period, you still only need a majority, a strict majority. And the support, this curve is actually old. It should start at 100, but whatever. If you imagine this is going down from 100, it's essentially we're saying that there must be 100% turnout for the vote to end immediately. So for the vote to end immediately, there must be 100% turnout, and of that turnout, everyone must have said either yes or abstain. There can be no dissent. And as time goes on, we accept less and less turnout. Yeah, until eventually, after 4 weeks, we accept a very low turnout. But our assumptions are that if this is like something that's going to break the system, probably within 4 weeks, much of the system, much of the responsible users of the voters within the system will have taken their vote and, made sure that there is enough dissent that it can't pass. Yeah. So that's when we can customize these curves for the different kinds of tracks, the different privilege levels that that governance facilitates within the system to change the elements of the system. If it's something relatively minor, like pass a tip or pass a small treasury funding, then we can imagine these curves get close to 0% or 50% quite fast. Yeah, meaning that unless something is very controversial, it will, or unless turnout is very low indeed, it will end quite fast. Whereas for privilege levels that are increasingly higher, like for example, altering a sensitive parameter of the chain, changing the economics, or like doing some arbitrary upgrade, like altering the system, altering the constitution essentially, then we have much stringent requirements and it's likely to take much longer to resolve. Yeah, good. So there's one of the sort of intros into OpenGov. Let's get back to the, let's do some questions, if there are any questions on the previous material.
From my opinion, a problem with like governance system is that they are, let's say, polarized towards wealth, that like more money can buy you more power in different systems. And I have the impression that there's a good chance that that could be changed with blockchain governance. And I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Blockchain governance blockchain was a great invention because it introduced the ability to be free from needing to trust. If we can create a rules-based system, if we can define a system of rules, we can use blockchain to ensure that those rules are enforced. You can do so in a very low barrier way, a very low cost way. This is a major innovation. But unless we can define the right rules, we will not be able to fix anything at a fundamental level. And if voting, if there is some issue that whereby voting necessarily for essentially either human psychology or like for some non rule corruption reason, ultimately boils down to money being able to buy voting power, then blockchain isn't going to fix it. What blockchain can do is make sure that if we can imagine or invent a rules-based system that governs the collective well, and that is, I don't know, resistant to some sort of financial based capture, then great, and blockchain can probably be used to implement it. But we need to actually imagine we need to think of that system. And blockchain in and of itself is not going to deliver that set of rules.
Yeah, I meant more like a mathematical system. Like you could define functions trying to redistribute the wealth in some way or something like that, which would not be easily possible in like social governance systems.
It certainly opens up the possibility to non-voting based governance systems, which may possibly be able to be designed to maximize utility. But as I mentioned earlier, it could be at a cost of apparent, simplicity, transparency, and yeah. I mean, I think the strongest thing I can say about blockchain is it opens the door to a greater design space. But I don't think in and of itself it's going to fix any conditions of humanity. People are still willing to give up temporary freedom for a bit of money. Sorry, if people are willing to give up long-term freedom for a bit of temporary money, then humanity is pretty screwed.
Is there a possibility of combination of voting mechanisms create a much better a system that will be much more efficient in all parts of utility, legitimacy, and practicality? Meaning, like democracy for voting for groups, then this group will capture a specific subject, and then there will be a random dictator for that subject every day.
I mean, in cryptography, we compose different primitive mechanisms to deliver, more useful composite mechanisms. I don't see why the same shouldn't be true of collective decision making. This is what we did in. I mean, we already do this in OpenGov, right? We did it in Gov1 as well. In OpenGov, we have a fellowship that is a more sort of rules-based meritocratic collective, which is able to unlock a potential set of curves, but those set of curves use, this this thing that I just introduced now. And in fact, we use the set of curves also in the fellowship, so that the fellowship votes on whether these new set of curves should be used or the old ones, is also elongated in case it's controversial, right? So we're able to actually compose interesting systems from these sophisticated systems from these primitives. So basically, yes, I think we will, by composing these different voting systems and these different collective decision-making systems in different ways, we will probably come up with some fairly improved designs. And blockchain, as I said before, really opens the door to this design space where it simply could not have been open in the past. Mechanisms would have been too sophisticated.
Is it just heuristics and here? Yeah, Juan here. Is it just heuristics and personal opinion for what the best curve is, or is there some mathematical background for choosing each curve?
There's mathematical background for choosing limits, like the bounds of the curve. So whether it goes from 100% down to 0, down to 50, or whatever, there's mathematical reasons for selecting the fact that it actually goes down. It doesn't go up and then down and then up again. There is no real modeling for what the curve's shape should be given these limitations, whether it should just be a straight line down or whether it should be like some quadratic or reciprocal or whatever. For that, it's just, I mean, we have some vague modeling of like what we kind of understand from voting behavior in the past with Gov1, and some security limitations, assumptions, for example, on active voting weight, like active votes and votes that we know are probably going to be honest. So I think we assume something like 30% there will be an honest 30% turning out to vote within 12 hours. And based on that assumption, we can model like curves, similarly with tipping. Like there are some assumptions that we use to help bound our design space for the curves, but a lot of it is empirical. At the end of the day, it's like you try it, you sort of nudge things, you nudge the parameters if they seem impractical, and you have to like constantly be keeping an eye on, voter dynamics, like who's turning out, how much is in parachains, like for example, if DOT is in crowd loan, if DOT's locked up in crowd loans, it's unable to be used for voting. So there's also this kind of these sort of economics that you have to take into account. But I mean, it's hard. It's an experiment. Right? It's like a social experiment. So we're constantly gathering data and having to reaffirm assumptions and redesign or nudge, adapt these curves.
So mine is kind of two things. The first is kind of just a comment, not really a question, but have you heard of Lieberland?
Yeah.
So they're using Substrate currently to build a governance for their land.
Yep.
Just wondering your thoughts on that kind of experiment of having a real world physical property that, I mean, it's not their property, but takes on what they're doing.
Well, I think it's probably quite charitable to say real world, but sure. It will be an interesting if there is some actual territory where people actually live and work and want to control the rules in which they cohabit, then I think this would be a really interesting environment to test OpenGov, definitely. But I don't know of any anywhere where people actually live and work and like long term want to stay.
They keep getting kicked out by the Czech government.
Yeah.
And then my second question is that I'd argue we're a collective, right? So
Sure.
which type of collective would we be? Because I can make a decision and it might be impactful, but no one's like, it's very almost a decentralized.
Well, the question is, this collective, what is its interaction with the rest of the world? And I think the answer is, there probably isn't one. So in that definition, it's not really a collective in the strong sense of the word, because it has no voice, it has no unity. For a collective to be a collective, there needs to be some unit representation and some unit interaction. But if it were to create, if the collective, this group of individuals were to create some means of defining, its constituent parts and its, I suppose, a means of creating instructions by which that means represented the authority of the collective, and that could be like resource ownership. It could be like power, force, like then we can start thinking of it as an actual legitimate collective.
Thank you.
I would like to ask about into the Nash equilibrium of the direct democracy. What do you think, or maybe a quick thoughts of, I know that you have already said that blockchain, it's a tool, not maybe the solution, but do you think that through blockchain we could, and introducing this kind of advanced democracy, we could move away from that equilibrium into something that is more survival of the collective as an objective, because as we are right now, it's kind of questionable at some point?
I mean, this survival is a natural, like I mean natural as in it's fundamental in nature. Like if something that is identifiable is not self-interested, is not interested in its continued existence, if it's not a survivor, then it will exist and then not exist, right? There has to be some reason for it to continue to exist. Generally, it has to be interested in its own survival. So if something is not interested in it, if it's not providing a reason for its continued existence, if it's not like fighting for survival, then it will die. Like it will disband, it will disperse, it will not exist anymore. So it's not that I'm saying pre-existing systems are not interested in their own survival. I mean, a dictatorship is very much interested in the continued survival of the dictatorship, like the dictator, I should say, is. Now, it may not be well suited, it may not be, very able to survive, but this is a different question. It's like what the main thing about the decision-making mechanism should be is that it's the primary goal. Because if it's not the primary goal, if there's something more important than surviving, then the likelihood is that over time there will be a wedge issue, like a polarizing issue, where it's like do the survival thing and stay alive, or do this other thing that is your primary goal and don't. Yeah, and presumably if it's the primary goal, you do it, and then you don't survive anymore. Now it might say, well, you know, this collective doesn't survive, but a larger collective does survive because of this. Like maybe it's an assimilation, and maybe it's the desire of the collective, of the constituents of the collective, that the collective does disband or does become assimilated into the larger collective. So you can see this, for example, when a corporate takeover and the shareholders decide to essentially disband their collective and allow it to be assimilated into a larger collective. So it's not that it doesn't exist, however, it's if the collective, it's like it has to be a decision, it has to be an explicit priority. And if the explicit priority is, I don't know, in the case of the corporate takeover of the shareholders, is not to retain the collective, but it is to make money, yeah, then it's likely that the corporation will ultimately be assimilated, that it won't exist indefinitely, because it's not the primary survival, is not the primary thing. And it might therefore be that the constituents, that company is unable to retain great talent, because the great talent wants, like maybe, you know, supposing the great talent wants to be in a collective, a company, that will retain its identity over time, that won't be taken over by a large corporation, that won't become assimilated into some other corporation with a different identity, a different work ethic, a different leader, a different vision, and so forth. So you know, choosing one and not the other can have really significant like side effects. The most obvious one being its existence may be curtailed, but there may be other things as well. All right, let's move on. So try and get through this a bit faster. Voting mechanisms, right? So this is going to be a little bit more mathematical, but a little bit less critical thinking-y, but still. So voting mechanisms are used essentially to aggregate information, aggregate preferences, aggregate opinion into like a single digestible datum, right? We tend to think of voting mechanisms as like just the way of making a decision. It's like you put the vote, and then the decision is a direct, the vote represents the decision, right? Whatever the vote ends up being, that's the decision that you take. That's what we would call a binding vote, yeah? But in principle, voting does not need to be binding. It can be informed. In the general sense, it is merely information with which decisions, which can influence decision making. The influence does not need to be absolute. Okay. You know, generally with voting, there's candidates. If it's a binary vote, there's two candidate options, right? Do it, don't do it. Red, blue, left, right, whatever. There might be many candidates. There might be many options, right? People, policy. It could be people that are the options. Could be policies. Could be parties. Yeah. We have ballots or you know, whatever. Like there's a bunch of different words. I can't think of many others, but anyway. Voters declare their preferences in these ballots, right? They declare, they provide information, and then the voting mechanism is basically a way of aggregating this information into a single winner, or possibly a set of winners. That's doesn't necessarily need to be a single candidate. There are voting mechanisms that will fill a committee rather than filling a single chair. And we can think of several criteria. There are 3 really big ones, but can think of criteria that will judge the mechanism by. It turns out that one of the most important criteria is simplicity, and this is in order to, historically at least, implementation, right? We didn't have the impressive tooling, the internet, and so forth that we have now. So simplicity was crucial for actually making it possibly implementable. And it's also important, as we know from the past, legitimacy. Simplicity can help with legitimacy. Several different voting mechanisms we can cover. Single vote and ranked vote are the sort of 2. There's actually a 3rd one that we can put in here, approval vote. But basically, single vote is where you would vote on one from a number of options. Approval vote is where you would vote on as many as you like from the options. And generally speaking, in approval voting systems, voting for no options and voting for all of the options is the same thing. So to have an opinion like at all, you have to vote for at least one and not vote for at least one. And then we also have ranked vote mechanisms, which are sort of some of the more complex ones. These are essentially where you order the ones that you like, starting with the one that you like the most and ending with the one that you like the least. We'll look a little bit at vote splitting and strategic voting, and there's a few criteria. We'll look at the monotonicity criteria because this can be quite important. Okay, so single vote mechanisms. These are a bit crappy in general, right? They do not provide an adequate information conduit from the voter into the aggregation in general. Yeah. They dismiss too much potential information between the voter and the aggregation. Plurality voting is, but they're simple, and so historically they've been the easiest to implement, or indeed the most possible to implement, and so they tend to be the ones that actually are still around in the world, particularly in voting systems that have been around since like the 1700s or earlier. So plurality voting, basically it's just the thing that I mentioned in the UK, and it's many places in the world it's the same. There's a group of people, they all vote for whatever it is that they like, the candidate, the option that they like, and you just choose the one that has the most votes. So in the case of our film movie night example, we would always get comedy, yeah, because that's got 40% of the votes, the others only had 30% of the votes. So every time it would be comedy, even though the majority does not want comedy. So it's not a great system, but it is simple. It's very, very simple, right? Everyone votes for one thing, and then you just count them up. That's the main thing it has going for it. In fact, it's arguably the only thing it has going for it. Pretty awful. And it's so sad that most of the world still uses it. Okay, some of the slightly more enlightened voting system use something a little bit more complex, 2-round voting system, or even a multi-round voting system. 2-round is the simplest version of it. And basically, in the 2-round system, you do a plurality vote, so everyone votes for one candidate, and then assuming that one of the candidates doesn't get more than 50%, you then take the top 2 candidates and then do a runoff vote, right, a second vote, and it's whichever one gets the most, because now one of them will at least have 50%. Now you can extend this to like just a multi-round voting system where you just continually reduce the candidate list one at a time until a candidate gets more than 50%. For example, the Tory, one of the political parties in the UK that had a recent vote, the vote actually before the recent vote, but they're all quite recent because we've run through so many candidates, use a multi-round voting system. So you start with a wide field of candidates. Maybe you set a benchmark. Everyone must get at least 2% of the vote to carry on to the next round. And if everyone gets over 2%, then maybe you also limit it by saying we will have to drop a candidate. We'll drop the one with the least amount of votes, and you just keep cycling until you end up with just one. Yeah, we'll see. We'll do some playing around with this. So here's some examples just to show you the weaknesses of these systems. In the case of a plurality vote, suppose this is the sort of ground truth, right? So there are, in terms of, we have 3 candidates, A, B, and C, and there are 8 voters that would place A first, then B, then C. 7 voters would do C first, then B, then A. 5 voters would do B first, then C, then A. Okay. Well, plurality votes only looks at the first choice, yeah? So there are 8 voters for A, 7 voters for C, 5 voters for B. So A wins. That's how a plurality vote would do it. Now, A did not get the majority. There are 12 votes not voting for A and only 8 votes voting for them. But still, they get to win. We do a 2-round system. Then in the first round, sort of A is still the kind of winner, the sort of the first initial winner, and C is the runner-up. So what we do is we just say, B, you can't win anymore. No one can vote for B. You can only vote for either A or C. And then we find out that actually A still only has 8 votes, but all of the rest vote for vote for C. So all of B's 5 voters, it turns out that they prefer C to A, and so they all move to C, and C ends up winning. So that takes into account basically their first and the second choice. This is, we kind of see. This is an example of possibly of vote splitting, and where vote splitting is problematic. So specifically for the plurality, vote splitting would be where, in this case, B and C have similar policies, yeah, and 5 voters go one way, 7 voters go the other way, and if we just look at the first round or the plurality vote, because of that, the candidate with the least popular policies wins. And in a 2-round system, and some other systems that we'll look at, we're actually able to work it through and find that one of the candidates from the set of who has one of the more popular policies that support the more popular policies wins. Good. And this, here's some other interesting things where you can have field candidates with similar names and stuff. So this is a story from India, and the candidate that was the political favorite to win, that everyone was backing. When the ballot paper came, there were another 10 independent candidates that were registered with the same name. And they didn't have any history whatsoever in politics. It's just that the opponent to this favorite candidate, like went to the phone book, looked up all the people that had the same name as his opponent, and then paid them to enter the political arena for this specific vote, with the aim of splitting the vote amongst them. Yeah, this wouldn't have worked in an approval vote system where you're able to vote for many different candidates, but it does work if you're in a single round vote. And in the end, the original guy, won by a mere 1,200 votes, where the other candidates accumulated 70,000. So it almost worked. Yeah, so this is specifically. B and C might have similar policies, but if we only look at the first choice, the first preference, we end up electing a candidate with unpopular policies. Okay, so monotonicity, and it's I should point out, in this case, this is one of the reasons why there exists the Nash equilibrium for the two-party system, right? You don't want to, if you have just the first choice, you will eventually, these 12 voters who have some nuances, and some of them prefer the minor differences between B and C, some of them prefer C, some of them prefer B, right? But they will strategically align into a Nash equilibrium where they all either vote for C or all either vote for B, yeah? That's the correct thing for them to do strategically, for these 12 to do strategically. It's to disregard the fact that they have minor differences. They can be different wings of the same party, basically. They can fight out their differences internally and present just a single option to the overall voters. Yeah, and this means that we have less useful representation when we get to the actual decision of who to elect. Yeah, we end up with like factionism, we end up with horse trading, we end up with a very closed and opaque system of policy making, and we end up with only two candidates. So this is why it's so bad to have this single vote system. It's dysfunctional and degenerate. Unfortunately, it's how some of the largest and richest democracies function. Right, so monotonicity criterion. Basically, this is the thing of if the voters change in order to increase their preference for a candidate that is already winning, like that would already win the poll, then that increase of preference for the winner should not, under any circumstances, make them lose. Yeah? It sounds dumb. Like, why would it, how could a voting system like work? Like, how could that be a reasonable voting system if an increase in the preference for a candidate would cause them to lose when they were otherwise winning? Well, it turns out that this multi-round system actually does not satisfy the monotonicity criteria. So suppose you have this set of preferences. So if we go do a two rounds of it, first round we get these two guys prefer A. So sorry, these two rows prefer A. So that's 8 voters, and 7 voters for C. So B only gets 6 voters, C gets 7. Okay, so A and C go through, and then we look at the second choice. If they didn't vote for A or C, so it's these guys, and 3 of them prefer A, 3 prefer C. So we end up with A winning with 11 compared to B winning with, compared to C winning with 10. Easy enough. Now, suppose these guys at the bottom, so let's go back So A wins, 11 votes to C's 10. Suppose these guys switch, these two voters at the bottom switch. Instead of preferring C, they prefer A. So now we top them up. A now has more votes at the beginning, right? Great. It's got 10 votes. So far, so good. But instead of C being the runner-up, B is the runner-up with 6 votes. Okay. Then we get to the second round, and we push it all through, and then it turns out that quite a lot of votes that would have been for C are now for B. Yeah. A keeps its 10 votes, but now B ends up pipping it with these 5 voters and gets 11. And so by these guys preferring A to C, the previous winner, A no longer wins. When we have this, when we have voting systems where as a voter giving the correct information, expressing your preferences transparently, leads to your preferences not being, or the aggregation of preferences not being reflective, then a voter, or a sensible, a rational voter, must alter their preferences, must alter the information that they give so it becomes non-reflective of their preferences. Basically, they must not be transparent. They must not give correct information about themselves in order to maximize their own, how much their information is reflected within the overall aggregation of the system. Basically, they have to lie in their votes. And when voters start lying, when voters start passing information which is incorrect about their preferences, then we obviously end up in a big mess. Yeah? And the name for this big mess is strategic voting. And really, if we expect voting systems, if we expect democratic systems to work, we need to get rid of strategic voting, right? We need to ensure that transparency, honesty, is the best policy. Yeah. Otherwise, it's we end up with all sorts of chaos and complexity and random, arbitrary stuff happening at the end. Now there are ways of overcoming this with when we have ranked candidates. One of them was this guy Borda, French mathematician in 1770, who created this sort of. Firstly, he demonstrated that plurality voting could result in the election of the least favorite candidate. That was the first thing. It's like shook up a bit of the system there. And he defined the least favorite candidate as the one that would lose in any head-to-head competition with all the other candidates. And so he created a new system that bears his name, Borda count, which would uphold this criteria of the winner would win in every, or the winner would win if we, or the winner would win the most pairwise competitions with the other candidates. Ideally, all of them. May not be possible to win. So the way it works is every voter ranks all candidates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And we just interpret that as giving a monotonically decreasing amount of points, right? So for the first choice, they get k-1, where k is the number of candidates. There's 10 candidates. The first choice gets 9 points. Second choice gets 8 points. Third choice gets 7, and so on down to 0. And then you just add up all the points that each candidate gets given. Borda count as a voting system is monotone. It satisfies the monotonicity criteria. If you switch your preference and prefer increase a candidate's rank, then if that candidate was already winning, it will still keep winning. It will do no worse. Yeah. And there you go. This is an example. So in this case, with these systems, B would win because it gets 25 points. And I think if we did a single pass, then it would be A. And what was our splitting? And if we did a 2-round system, I think this is the same data, then C would win. So it actually gives a different answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out it's the exact same example.
Yeah.
So, and that's a funny thing about this particular example, that under plurality, you have A as the winner. In 2-round, you have C as the winner. And in board account, you got B as the winner. So that shows how important it is to choose the right mechanism and to decide how to, the criteria that you want to highlight, what it is that you want to achieve with your mechanism.
So this is like all three are ways of aggregating this information. Right? This information is hugely multidimensional. Yep, like it's a huge amount of data. It's not useful to work with on its own. So we're looking for ways to aggregate it into something that's usable. Yep. Ideally, a single candidate, right? That's what this is for, boiling it down to a single candidate. And yes, there are 3 ways that we've named 3 ways of doing that. And it turns out that even though they're all like used, they're all like considered reasonable voting systems, they all come up with different answers. So aggregation is not a trivial problem to solve. And one must be very conscious of the options and their advantages and disadvantages when considering how to aggregate this, this information. Why would we ever choose something as dumb as the single vote? Well, because it's simple. But I think with the systems that we have, we probably don't need it to be quite so simple. Broadly speaking, there is a trade-off. Simple systems tend to be worse performing in terms of aggregating information effectively, reflecting the preferences of the collective. More complex systems can more adequately reflect the information in the perspective, the information of the collective, but do not necessarily they're not necessarily easy to follow, transparent, easy to understand, and so forth. So you may lose some legitimacy by using them. At the end of the day, we are taking a massively multidimensional data base, right? Set of preferences, and distilling it into a single choice. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. Yeah, it's not possible. You will always lose some information when you aggregate data so aggressively. And it's just about, you just have to make a decision. Well, firstly, there is this decision of like simplicity and transparency versus, you know, certain criteria that it may or may not uphold. And secondly, we should also consider very carefully whether we really do want to aggregate into just a single datum. Or maybe we want to aggregate into a more multidimensional result. Maybe it's possible to not just elect a single dictator, but like elect a committee and then do something with that committee. Yeah, there may be other ways of utilizing this huge input of voter preferences than just trying to elect or decide on a single choice. Okay, good. We're not going to take a break because there was we already had one. So the idea is for this to be a little bit more open, and we're going to look at a few different, 4 different examples, contexts of voting. I'll open it to the audience. Can you think of any real life scenarios where these different goals of decision-making systems clash?
What if we want to preserve anonymity of the voter? In some scenarios, there might be more possible rankings than there are voters.
Mhm.
And so something might compromise their identity.
Certainly, I mean, I think without even going into like rankings, privacy is a really important element when we look at legitimacy. Yeah, if you can't count, if you can't see that like everyone has voted and the votes actually add up, and you can't check that your vote has not been either duplicated or not counted, then you run into issues of legitimacy. You need to have a very reasonable expectation that your vote was properly counted. And anonymity, without the proper tooling, can definitely cause an issue for that. And even with the proper tooling, for a relatively lay voter community, it may still be an issue. People don't read code, and even people who do read code don't understand. I don't understand how ZK snarks work at a significant depth. Why would I believe that a proof, a zero knowledge proof, actually did count the votes correctly? I probably would, but maybe I shouldn't. But utility is also, if we do not have privacy for our voting, then we can sacrifice the utility, or we may end up with a corrupt voting system simply because if people are being watched, they will tend to take alternative actions. People are held accountable to their voting preferences, then they will probably alter what they vote for. Like various studies have shown that depending on whether votes are private or public, people will vote for different things. So indeed, anonymity and privacy represent a substantial trade-off here.
Okay, so to answer the question, where can you think of real life scenarios where these goals clash? So I'm thinking the U.S. government, where the current abortion laws, because it's practical that a woman should, own a body and all, and then where we have the guns, which are still let loose, anyone can own a gun. So I think this is where this goals clash, because it's more like, oh, the safety of people and then the rights of people, it's still that part is still clashing, because the goal of the United States government or decision making system is actually democracy, quote unquote. So in that sense, they were not really practicing the core truth of democracy as human rights for women.
I don't know to what decision that's an issue with the decision-making system per se, but certainly, certainly the supposed rules of a system can often clash with the scope of the decision-making mechanism. And, you see this. I've seen this in in the news in the past in countries' political systems, but I'm not going to go into details. But like the US, okay, there is the Constitution, and in principle, laws have to respect the Constitution, unless there is, of course, an amendment to the Constitution, but that requires substantially more commitment from the voters than passing a regular law. But there can be a contradiction between what the Constitution lays out and what the current law-passing sentiment would like to do. And of course, you know, there is theoretically a non-political apparatus, assembly, the Supreme Court, whose job it is to evaluate and make the trade-off between the legislature that can, you know, alter law and yet still uphold the principles set forth in the Constitution for like freedom. Unfortunately, of course, these things eventually are susceptible to political capture. Nothing is works outside of politics fully, and I think we're kind of quite possibly seeing that right now. But anyway, yeah, it's there can often be a trade-off between the rules of a system and the scope of its decision making.
There are situations where, in specifically scenarios where great social unease or great social stress, where the government can impose a state of exception, where constitutional guarantees are suspended temporarily in order to reimpose order.
Yeah.
In that cases, legitimacy can be greatly undermined,
Yep.
but in favor of practicality. In order to, for example, here in Argentina in 2001, during the final days of December, there were really a huge uproar, social uproar against the government, and there were a lot of protests, a few people, a lot of strikes. So a state of exception was imposed in order to regain order. Some people died, the president resigned, and so on and so on. The very imposition of the state of exception proves or confirms the lack of legitimacy of the government at that moment, because the population or the civilian population refuses to acknowledge their authority when they claim that they should go home, they should vacate the streets and stuff like that.
Indeed, yeah. Exceptional situations can often cause frictional trade-offs between these things. Say frictional in that there are controversial trade-offs between the need for practicality and the need for legitimacy. And for a period, indeed, a different trade-off may be made, and one that would not sustain or would not sustain the test of time, shouldn't last forever. And well-written constitutions both limit the scope of what an emergency situation can, what sort of level of practicality / concentration of power an emergency situation can provide, and how long it can last before a more legitimate source of authority can determine whether it continues to be an emergency. But yeah, different constitutions differ, and of course their interpretation can also differ over time. All right, let's move on to another one. So in a country that runs referendums periodically, turnout is only 2%. It's quite low. Older people tend to vote much more than younger people. President changes the voting mechanism so that in each referendum, only 5% of the population elected uniformly at random is allowed to vote. So he reduces basically this is a sampling mechanism. 1 in 20 people is allowed to vote. And as a result, every person is allowed to participate in 1 out of 20 referenda on average. And now it's observed that 80% of the people allowed to vote actually do vote. Some degree of exclusivity increases the turnout. So the global turnout grows. And the previous correlation between age and willingness to vote decreases substantially. Would you support this? Hands up. I would support it. Not so many, less than half. We assume it is. For those who would not support it, why not?
So my thought process is the 2% that were originally voted, potentially won't be included in the 5% that can vote, which might be fine. But those are, but those might be the people really passionate, and just due to human nature, the 5% that do get to vote will almost necessarily have other people trying to influence their vote, and it just seems like it could get a little messy for the people that get selected.
Any others? I mean, more than half of you did not agree with this change, so I'd hope to see a few. But anyway, go on.
Oh, for me, the doubt is that 5% that is elected, how can we guarantee that it is actually uniformly elected and not pre-selected?
Could you repeat? I didn't quite. It's pretty. That microphone has super low volume, so you kind of have to shout.
Oh,
That's better.
Oh, my doubt is the 5% of the population that is elected, how can we guarantee that it is actually uniformly selected and not pre-selected?
And not pre-selected.
Pre-selected.
I mean, I think the assumption is that it's uniformly at random. So
that is an assumption.
But I would agree there that even if it is completely fair, it would be difficult for people to believe it. I mean, I think anything that is not simple might be a problem with the perceived fairness.
Well, I mean, it's. I don't know of any systems that implement this in practice, but certainly people believe the lottery is fair, and technically you wouldn't need that much of a complicated lottery to select 5% of the population at random, right? I mean, there's probably something about someone's identity, like birthday, for example, that is relatively uniformly distributed, and you can have a machine that with balls in it, and it's just like you select, I don't know, whatever, 15, 17 dates, got 365 balls in, select 17 balls, everyone with a birthday on those days get to vote. That's pretty simple. I think a lot of people could get behind that as being fair.
I wonder, it doesn't seem to take into consideration the level of controversy of any particular referendum, like all being equal. But what in a situation, that's what caused me to pause at least, in a situation where the referendum is particularly controversial, and then, the access to that vote is that limited to that random selection of people.
It's true. Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't take into account the possibility that there is a referendum that actually would fetch where were we? Would fetch a turnout of 80%, right? Sure, but I think we'll assume from the top sentence that it's pretty closely centered around 2%. So it's just that 98% actually don't care. You know, they're just got other things that they want to do.
It seems that it would make more sense to have the I guess the weight of each demographic
You have
vote.
to speak closer. Sorry.
Yeah, it seems like it would make more sense to have the weight of each demographic's vote. I guess to have the people who would have, I guess, be affected by those decisions longer. So instead of just having like 5% from each demographic, it seems like it would make more sense to have, I guess, to have it weighted by how long I guess the demographics are going to be affected by the vote decisions. So that's
that's an interesting point. Does that mean that people like terminally ill patients whose expected life is 6 months should have an extremely low weight of the vote, whereas mothers who are expecting a child should actually have 1.5 times what their vote would otherwise be?
That's also a very good question, and I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah. I think the key thing is that although we have these three, utility, legitimacy, and practicality, that we must revert back to the primary directive, which is the welfare of the collective. And this, while legitimacy can help retain coherency of the collective, can help prevent the possibility of portions of the collective sort of losing faith and leaving or disrupting it. We must ultimately judge legitimacy under the overarching goal of welfare of the collective. And if there are, and therefore we mustn't fall into a trap of the fairness trap of trying to sort of state, well, if it's a person, they should get a vote, and if it's not yet if it's an adult, they should get a vote. Like, votes should be only for over 18s. Votes should be over only 21-year-old. Votes should be for over 25 years old. Votes should only be for those who have passed their education. Votes should only be for those who have passed a university education. Votes should be according to how long you're likely to continue in the thing. Votes should be for residents and not citizens. Votes should be like there are all sorts of ways that we can change according to our specific definition of fairness, and we fall into this fairness trap of like switching and moving our vote weights and vote sets between different individuals, or different sets of individuals. Ultimately, this is actually just used by political powers to maximize the possibility that they will get re-elected. This is happening in the UK at the moment with one of the political parties, one of the big two, wanting to reduce the voting age to 16 years instead of 18. Yeah, simply because 16 and 17-year-olds will tend to vote for this party rather than the other party.
Thank you.
Hi. I would like to ask you a question because I would like to know why for you is important to grow the turnout.
I think this is an exceptionally good question, and I think it is not immediately obvious. So the primary reason, or the primary reason that people will tend to give, so this is what I'd say if I were just a sort of casual observer for this stuff, is that it improves legitimacy. More people are part of a vote being made, then there's less chance that anyone feels that their voice was not heard, that anyone feels it was illegitimate. A more, I think, rational answer, I mean, that's certainly not a bad point, but I don't think it's the whole argument. A more rational answer would be, it improves the ability to collect information on behalf of the collective decision-making process. So there is a process by which the collective will make a decision. That process will have inputs and it will give an output. The output is the decision. The inputs, well, can be many things, But we assume with voting systems that the inputs are basically preferences, right? They are stated preferences of the constituents. If few of the constituents give information, then our algorithm that aggregates this information and calculates a decision from it has less information to work with. And as such, unless we believe that that subset of information is fundamentally of a higher quality, of a greater amount of underlying, useful information, should really talk about data and information. So we have less data to work with. And unless we believe that less data, right, 2% rather than 100% of preferences, unless we believe that 2% of data, that subset of data, contains effectively more information than for making the decision, then we should prefer to get all of the data. Unless we believe that filter is somehow improving the quality of the data, that filter, that dropping of the 98%, then it's better to have more data because we have a better chance of making a better decision, a decision which maximizes the welfare of the collective. That's the more fundamental reason why we would want an increased turnout. Now, of course, an increased turnout isn't enough. An increased turnout doesn't guarantee more information. But these collective decision-making systems, like voting, they need input, or they will just end up with arbitrary output, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So we need high-quality input. Now, the assumption is that if you collect enough of it, you'll end up with high-quality output. But we probably need, if there are ways of improving the information content of the input, even better. That's even better, right? So one of the things that we could do, one idea. Okay, this is actually not a bad idea. One of the ideas is you restrict the input, right, to 1 in 20 voters. By restricting, you increase exclusivity, and you increase the chances. I suggest, I'm not saying, but that's the premise of this. You increase the chances that those 1 in 20 actually make an effort in educating themselves. You could force them to make an effort, right? You could pay them. It's difficult to pay everyone, but if you take a subset of potential voters at random, so it's fair, then you can actually say, right, you're going to get given $1,000, but you have to complete this mini course first, right? You have to go to a short critical thinking course. Yeah, you have to go to the Polkadot Voting Academy or something. Right? And maybe you have to pass it. Maybe there's an exam at the end, like a short test to make sure that you've got some idea about what was being talked about. That is a way of improving the information content. And it could be that the information content coming from even just 1% of your voting population, the data coming from just 1% of your voting population, under the right circumstances, can result in more information getting to your decision-making algorithm, your vote counter if you want, but we can think of more sophisticated mechanisms than just simple vote counting. Then in the case where you just trawl everybody without any real incentive for them to represent themselves transparently, or indeed represent the world and the issue and the solution to any issues well. Like, the decision-making mechanism needs information to work with, or, as I say, it'll be garbage out.
Actually, one comment on that. It occurs to me, I think what you're describing is jury duty.
in the sense that at random you're selected in the population to be paid to do a job to make a decision, right? Which it's a very valuable one. So I guess my answer to this question is it really depends. There's so many factors, but it can be a powerful tool to have some of this randomness in introducing instability and potential like outcomes that couldn't have happened in the broader populace. Yeah.
No? Okay, let's move on. Okay, a holy grail. Holy grails, a holy grail of voting theory is finding a voting mechanism that simultaneously offers local privacy and global transparency. So back to the privacy question. No one should be able to see another person's ballot, but enough aggregate information about the ballot should be public so that everyone can verify the correctness of the result. Yeah, so we get privacy, but we also have some degree of legitimacy, some degree of credible belief that the outcome is correct. Suppose such a mechanism is created using cryptography, however, it requires every voter to use a private key, be trained in the basics of cryptography. A nation's president proposes to use such a mechanism, but the feedback from the population is negative because people don't trust the maths, digital voting, or cryptography. Let's start with this, but we can also expand this into the realm of futarchy, where it's not merely using this to cryptography to count the votes, but also using the aggregate information in a non-transparent way. Maybe we feed it not just into a vote counting system like, you know, first past the post or border count or whatever, but we feed it into a machine learning system, right? We feed it into ChatGPT and just say, right, here's the preferences of the population, tell me what the correct decision is. Yeah. So we're looking at, you know, transparency. A couple examples. What is this? What should the president do? Should he force it through? Should the politicians force it through, knowing that it's good, that it's the best? What's? Oops. Should the president force it through? Any thoughts?
I think I can think of an example with like ATMs at first, that when they were introduced, no one trusted them, but they were pushed through anyway. From my understanding, people now trust them because they used them and they were proven. So there was a clear benefit of just pushing it through. So yeah, the utility, I think, is way higher than the legitimacy problem, since, you know, once the utility is going to be proven in time, the legitimacy will increase in this case.
Yep. So firstly, 2 points there. People are a little too conservative, oftentimes, not trusting newfangled inventions until some time passes and they've used them or their friends and family have used them and they realize that actually it's probably fine.
Yeah, the default bias, I guess, in this case.
Yeah. Yes. Any other?
Hi. Yeah. Hi. I would just do a massive education campaign with incentives.
Education is certainly one way. Education, I think, can help a lot in these decision-making systems. The big elephant in the room regarding education is it can become political, and either the educators become political or they become identified, rightly or wrongly, with a political direction, and then this can, again, if education becomes part of the requirements for voting or whatever, then it can cost legitimacy, as people who disagree with the educators in some sense, or disagree with the conclusions of the lessons that the educators are giving them, believe that the education is political and therefore want to get rid of it. annoyingly, this can be basically individuals disagreeing with reality a lot of the time. It's like you're feeding me this narrative of science, but yet I don't believe it. It's like, well, how do you argue with that? You're showing me this world, but that's not the world I want. Yeah, and it's it's hard. There's no good answer. Educate them while they're young and they don't have political, and educate critical thinking most of all is probably the two things. But yeah, it's very true.
For some time, and during the time, the people will convince themselves that the blockchain-based election are fine and are very transparent. Yeah, and yeah.
Yeah, I think over time, trust can be built in new inventions, cryptography, and so forth, but it can take time.
I think overall, I agree with Juan that they should push it forwards and people will trust it over time, provided that the negative sentiment is not too strong. You wouldn't want to implement something like this, and then the next election, people try to overthrow the government because they don't believe in the result. So I think the intensity of the negative sentiment is quite important here.
Yeah.
I think what plays in that though is whether or not this is a unique voting system. Do you have other methods of voting as well? Like the example Juan gave where ATMs were introduced and people didn't trust them to begin with. They still had another option in order to get like cash. They didn't have to use the ATM, so they were allowed to warm up to it in their own time. Whereas if we use the example of the voting system, this is the only way that people can vote, and anybody who does not want to use this is disenfranchised, then we're looking at overthrow of the government.
Indeed. Optionality, providing people with what they're used to, but trying to convince them voluntarily to move over to the better, more efficient, and in this case, less corruptible system is generally a good road to go down if you can.
I would just point out that in this particular example, usually local privacy works well only if you have a lot of people voting. So in this case, it could be an issue that if only 1% of the population wants to use this new thing, then it doesn't work. So that would be a caveat.
Good. All right. Penultimate example. Proof of stake. So in POS, proof of stake-based blockchain network, validators, the nodes that participate in the consensus protocol, produce blocks. It's possible to have a pure proof of stake mechanism where every token holder can participate in consensus directly, somewhat like proof of work. But most of the bigger projects basically do some sort of delegation or election to get to validators to a small set. So they essentially opt for representative. Democracy is pushing it, but representative sort of democracy of underlying token ownership, stake, whatever, and let token holders express their preferences for the set of active validators. So examples do this. There you go. There's a few. Why do we try to reduce the number of active voters, maintainers, operators?
Energy usage?
Yeah, it would, in essence, reduce the number of machines that need to be active at any one time. Speed? Huh?
Speed of the network?
Potentially. In principle, with block production, it shouldn't be such a big issue. But certainly for overall consensus, like finality, then it would become a much bigger problem.
The practicity. It's easier to find that consensus. It's the same, but like with fewer actors. I mean, if they represent, at least, it's easier to achieve that decision.
Indeed. Like overall, if you reduce the number of moving parts, your design space improves just because the problem becomes more tractable. And that's like a very fundamental like aid to solving the problem.
I think it increases democracy, because otherwise always the same big guys with all the big holders will have bigger voice always.
So if you reduce the number of network maintainers through some delegating fashion, how could you argue that the smaller holders would be better represented?
You don't always have the same voters every time.
So if we assume with a pure POS mechanism, where every token holder gets selected to create a block according to the proportion of tokens that they hold, then that's our benchmark, that's our baseline, yeah? If I hold 1% of the total tokens, then I will produce a block on average 1 in every 100 times. Whereas if I delegate to some larger producer or a collective, then why would I be better represented as a small holder? If I am forced to delegate simply because there are only 21 slots and I only contain 1%, I only have 1% of the tokens, well, I can't afford to get a slot myself. So I would have to somehow find other people that have a total of around 5% and back those people. And therefore, it's not clear why I would gain more than 1% of the influence. Why would I end up with more than 1% of the overall influence?
Yeah, I get the point.
I guess it could increase the quality of these operations depending on some assumptions, but in the current form, if it's just like based on balances, then I'm not sure that that's really even a collective, because individuals can move in and out, and there's also no guarantee that there's going to be a validator, that there will be validators. So this sort of creates a connection between which validators are validating and, I guess, the representative democracy. But without this, it's sort of a lottery that can be bought into in order to become a validator. So if that's the only mechanism for being a validator, then if over like a longer period of time, you could have to where people don't want to be validators anymore. And how do you get somebody to be a validator if they're not being validators anymore and all of the tokens are bought up? So yeah, that's not really a good cohesive answer, but yeah, it's a general idea.
So let's have a couple of other possibilities here. So one of them is simply that if you have more participants in a system, then there will tend to be a greater amount of information passed to keep the system in consensus, yeah? It's like if you've only got one participant in a system, it will stay in consensus necessarily. If you have two, then you'll only have one piece of information to pass every time some state changes. But as that grows, you especially if you are randomly selecting, then you're going to have substantially more pieces of information to pass the network. Now, different protocols will be potentially superlinear in this. For example, if you've got like a finality mechanism like PBFT, then the amount of data that you're passing will go up substantially more than if you have something more like what we have here, BABE, which is a relatively simple block production mechanism where the amount of data goes up proportionally to the number of nodes. But nonetheless, if we're talking about 21 nodes versus 1,000 nodes versus 64,000 nodes, then this is sufficiently large that the amount of overall costs of keeping the system will be substantially higher for the systems that have such large amounts of nodes and that allow everyone to join. And those costs will not be borne equally or proportionally to the amount of voting power that they effectively control. If someone has 10% of the network and they author a block 10% of the time, what happens here? Well, they will still only have to run one server. But if someone else has 1% of the voting power, well, they still have to run the server. Their hardware costs and bandwidth costs are still the same. Yeah. And yet they only have 1%. And if they have someone else with 0.1% or 0.01%, and they're still joining in, well, their bandwidth costs and their overall server costs are still the same. And yet they're doing less work for the network, they're getting less reward from the network, they're having less influence on the network, but yet their costs are still the same. And the longer this tail is, then the more overall cost to the network and the more disproportionate cost to the small participant, to the small holder of tokens. So realistically, economically speaking, it doesn't become sensible to be one of these small 0.001% holders that's constantly running a node with the same level of hardware resources as someone that's got a 10% of the voting power and token holding or whatever. So realistically, what happens is that these guys club together and form syndicates.
Yeah, I think also running a validator has some technical needs or knowledge. It has a high area of barrier of entry, and so essentially having a nomination mechanism can first of all lower this, because without really knowing how to run them, I can nominate people that I trust run them, and on the other hand, it allows me to, even on the network level itself, to have a mechanism that allows me to cooperate to achieve this, even if not every single person has the proper technical knowledge to run a node themselves. And secondly, I think running a node is so nuanced and there are so many factors a network over time could be interested in rewarding that that way that can also easily be represented without having to have some kind of mechanism to check, oh, okay, are these really decentrally distributed, or any of these factors you might care about over time. But instead you can see what is the community value, which kind of operators we actually want to run nodes in our network, how many nodes do we want to have from a single operator. All these things can then actually be done through this, and it's no longer just reserved for the few people that have the computational power and also the technical knowledge to really run a node 24/7.
Let's move on to the final thing, secure validators. Okay. So we saw that it's critically important for security to ensure that a set of the validators isn't captured by an adversary. Yeah. Suppose we succeed so that a supermajority of validators participate in consensus honestly. A priori, the mechanism for electing validators can be completely independent of the mechanism for deciding on upgrades. However, some projects merge them together. In particular, consider a project that on any referendum delegates the voting power of all the passive stakeholders to the set of validators. Yeah, so anyone that doesn't take a specific opinion on an upgrade, the validators get their decision-making power, their influence. Does this constitute the capture of the governance body? And can you think of examples where the interests of validators are markedly different from the interests of the collective?
I think what happened to EOS with the collusion problem they had is probably an example of this. You know, several producers got together and you started seeing like a bunch of less variety in the producers. So for sure, the interests there were different from the interests of the collective, I think.
Yep. Any other thoughts or examples or?
Maybe increasing the rewards for the validators that is economically incentivized.
Yes, indeed. Validators may very well have an opinion on whether they should earn more money. And that opinion may not be necessarily in the best interests of the collective as a whole.
The block size, right? The block size wars. That's just as a quick example of that.
Another example there, yes. So in Bitcoin, the miners have a vested interest to try to maximize the amount of rewards that they will get, which basically means maximizing the amount of work that they can do. But that's not necessarily in the interest of the collective, whatever that really means, of Bitcoin, in that it could lead to protocol centralization by forcing out smaller miners who have less of a chance of getting large blocks quickly. Any others? What if you want to change consensus mechanisms? Do you think validators might have an interest in that?
Maybe how they get selected for mining another block. Maybe they get some preference. They can do political stuff.
Right. So maybe a couple of possibilities here. If they have if they control a substantial portion of influence, and there is a proposal to increase or decrease the number of validators, they may have an interest.
Well, another one. Maybe if they are a proposal to change the mechanism of slashing, okay, related with nominators and validators will be a collusion decision.
Indeed, it may be that the voting system for determining the validator set may change. It may be that the consensus mechanism. So there's an example of in Ethereum, of course, where the mining algorithm was suggested to be changed, which validators, miners, had a pretty strong opinion on, that was not aligned especially well with other elements of the community. And of course, if you want to change the mechanism at all, like maybe moving from a proof of work to a proof of stake, it could very well be that your miners have a pretty strong opinion on whether they want to be made redundant or not. And we see this, this is a very particular subset, a very particular specialization of a more general problem, which is altering the collective decision-making algorithm or rules after they've already been set. It's very difficult to disempower the current voting bloc. Yeah? If you have a dictatorial system, it's quite unlikely that the dictatorship is selflessly going to step down and leave a democracy in their stead. Yeah? Similarly, if you already have an aristocracy, it's quite unlikely that the aristocracy is going to, en masse, walk away and allow a democracy to form in their absence. So it's we have to be very careful when we create the initial constitution of a system, because if we don't spend the right amount of consideration to ensure that it allows it to evolve over time, then we may be stuck with a system that cannot change, that has already effectively been captured by a minority that don't want to be disempowered.
I just want to say this, like, I see a similarity between this and the last question and the question about limiting voters to 5% of the population that's randomly selected. I was just going to make a joke that, like, I don't know, if I lived in Michigan and I had a yacht in Michigan and a hotel and a casino, and, you know, I might not want the young voters, right, to come in and vote, right? The older generation, the more incumbent generation, tends to, you know, most likely have the most accumulated stake, but also wealth or value, whatever you want to call it in the system, power. And so these things would all change that. They would affect the incumbents.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I had a question. You bring up a really good point that it might be very hard to change those with the power in the system here. And in particular, I'm wondering, we'll get into this later, so a preview of like censorship, right? We're able to screen what can come into the system to be considered even. And if you're trying to submit a proposal that's going to pass with so many threshold votes or whatever it might be to change the validator set, and now this distributed set of validators has all one collective goal is to stop that from passing, right? So it could be that the system is like you say, it's captured. Is there some way in which we can have a blockchain system like resistant or potentially immune to such a thing, that censorship can't be stopped for that kind of process?
There are two main sort of solutions I see to this. One of them, which I think is what we're kind of doing at the moment, which is try to ensure that there are enough validators such that it's likely that one of them will not take part in the censorship, and then have, you know, this random dictator model, so that it's very unlikely that this non-censoring validator would remain unelected for a very long time. The other, maybe more, the other stronger, possibly, mechanism would be to have some sort of commit reveal system, whereby the transactions are actually placed on chain by their hash, and so that they are in some sense committed to being executed before the validators actually know exactly what it is that they're executing. Now, of course, then the validators refuse to put on the pre-image, but there may be some cryptographic games that we can play such that they have no option, they have no choice in recognizing that the pre-image exists. I think Al and Jeff in the Web3 Foundation had some interesting ideas with using like some like distributed key system that Sysafras can do, whereby you could sort of pre-encrypt something and help guarantee that it will get on the chain without the validator necessarily knowing what it is. But some form of multi-party computation could allow for the possibility of blocks being created which guarantee that a determined transactor would be able to get that transaction through, or the chain stalls. That you can probably create a system where you can, if the block producer produces a block at all, it will have this transaction in.
Right. So then I guess you'll probably be able to solve such a way that at least we'll get to a point where the validators could halt the chain.
Yep.
And at that point, this new proposed system would need to be able to take that as the root which they continue to build off of. Something along those lines.
Yeah. I think if you have, if you're clever about your availability system, if you can sort of ensure that there is a body which says this pre-image is available, then you can basically force that whatever the hash of that pre-image is, you can get the hash on there before the as a means of sort of committing the validator set. Now that you know the pre-image is available, committing them to actually putting it on the chain. Like they may not, they can no longer say we don't know what this hash means. Yeah. And if they've already committed to executing the hash and they can no longer say they don't know what it means, then their only option is produce the block with a pre-image in as a transaction, or don't produce a block. If you can get to that point, then you basically, if you have one validator, one block producer that is okay with producing a block with this transaction in, then your chain will stay alive and you'll get your transaction. You'll have evaded censorship. And over time, it will become a very pressing economic question. Do you want rewards at all? Or, and if you do, then you have to include this transaction. And if you don't, well, then maybe we choose other validators, and you lose your stake. All right. One more, that will make this the last.
Thank you. I was thinking of Alex's example where he mentioned about the person in Michigan with the yachts and the houses and things. And I was thinking of the person in Michigan with that maybe they're a monk or someone who has given up the worldly possessions, because the analogy that I see is like validators, and I already see this in other ecosystems where they're block producers and they have all these transactions and they're actually selling the transaction. They're selling the data. They're allowing the transactions to be reordered and producing blocks in a certain order. And I could see in the future like an economy around this, like validators building off of this. And so this could be an issue because they have a lot of power. And so what if we made validators very dumb, in the sense of like very selfless? They do one thing, the transactions are opaque, and that's all they do. They produce a block.
Yeah, I mean, the dumber that we can make those, or the dumber the job, the simpler the job, the more trivial the job that we can make those who have power, notional power, like practical power, the better, because we can constrain their freedom to be a tyrant. Yeah, and if we can make their job completely trivial, and this is basically what the civil service is like. Civil service in a well-functioning country, their job, jobs of the civil servant should not include them making like opinionated decisions on how the country is run. Right? They should not be making policy decisions. Of course, there are not many countries with civil services that do not, behind in the shadows and the background, have a significant influence on policy, but that's what we should aim for. We should aim for these civil servants of the chain, these operators, these nodes, these maintainers, the keepers, to have as trivial a job as possible.